It was never meant to feel loud. Anne of Green Gables moves like a held breath, soft light drifting across green fields, voices that never rush, a world that feels gentle, patient, safe. It slows you down without asking permission, and that's exactly the trick. Because comfort like that doesn't happen by accident. It's engineered, measured, built layer by layer until effort disappears and serenity takes its place. Behind the storybook glow, behind the puffed sleeves and the calm music, there was pressure, time pressure, creative pressure, emotional pressure. What looks effortless on screen was shaped by risk, compromise, and quiet struggle hidden so carefully that most viewers never felt it. Anne of Green Gables didn't become comforting because it was easy to make. It became comforting because everything difficult was absorbed into the illusion. Casting decisions made under national scrutiny. Scenes filmed out of order that demanded emotional whiplash. Locations stitched together from places that were never meant to belong to the same world. Nothing here was found fully formed. It was assembled. These are the weird facts behind Anne of Green Gables, a production where warmth was constructed the hard way, and where struggle was transformed into something that still feels like home. Step into Avonlea. This is where the illusion began. Number 1. Anne of Green Gables didn't begin with love. It began with paperwork. Kevin Sullivan didn't discover Anne the romantic way people like to imagine. There was no childhood obsession, no worn copy of the novel with notes in the margins, no moment of being swept away by the story. What he had was a phone call, a proposal, a business opportunity that sounded interesting enough to investigate. His connection to Anne was thin, a vague memory of a teacher reading from the book when he was a child. Not the story itself, just the feeling that the title sounded familiar. And instead of opening the novel, Sullivan opened contracts. Before he committed emotionally, he committed legally. He began tracking down who actually owned the dramatic rights. And what looked simple on the surface quickly turned into a tangled mess of permissions, claims, and negotiations. Months passed, not in imagination, but in paperwork. Only after the legal maze was solved did Sullivan fully step into the project. Only then did he take on the roles of writer, director, and producer. Only then did Anne become more than a possibility on paper. That order matters, because Anne of Green Gables didn't grow out of nostalgia. It grew out of risk, out of a decision made before certainty, before comfort. The warmth people feel watching Anne didn't come from a creator chasing a childhood dream. It came from someone willing to gamble first, and trust that the story would catch up later. Anne didn't begin as a memory. She began as a calculated leap. Number 2. In the book, Anne arrives quickly, almost like a gust of red hair and words. Lucy Maud Montgomery doesn't linger on what came before. A few shadows, a few hints, enough to understand Anne has suffered, but not enough to slow the story down. Kevin Sullivan wanted the weight. He believed a child with that much imagination wasn't performing for attention. She was surviving. So instead of starting where the novel rushes forward, Sullivan reached backward. Working with co-writer Joe Wiesenfeld, he widened Anne's life before Green Gables, not to add melodrama, but to add cause and effect. The years with Mrs. Hammond became visible. The overcrowded house, too many children, endless chores, a routine so grinding that affection had no room to breathe. In the novel, those years barely exist. In the miniseries, they become the quiet explanation for everything Anne is. Her talking isn't cute, it's armor. Her imagination isn't whimsy. It's the one place no one can take from her. By the time Anne steps onto Prince Edward Island, the story no longer feels like it's beginning. It feels like it's interrupting something much harder. A rescue, not an arrival. And then Sullivan made a second adjustment, smaller on paper, but far-reaching in consequence. He nudged the setting forward in time. Montgomery's world is rooted in the 1,880 seconds. Sullivan eased it closer to the Edwardian era. The reason was simple. He wanted the world to feel softer, brighter, more welcoming to modern viewers. But that shift quietly rewired Anne's future. Move the clock forward, and suddenly later chapters of her life align differently. The world grows closer to global conflict, to adulthood shaped by a harsher century. Same girl, same Green Gables. But now there's a different shadow waiting down the road. What Sullivan did wasn't just adaptation. He gave Anne a deeper wound and placed her under a different sky. Once you see that, Anne's joy stops feeling naive. It feels earned. Number 3. Casting Anne Shirley was never going to be simple. It was going to be dangerous. Anne of Green Gables wasn't just another role. It was sacred ground, a character owned by memory, not by producers. Kevin Sullivan knew that one wrong choice could collapse the entire illusion before the first frame aired. So the search didn't begin casually. It turned into a national event, and it started with a legend. One day, Sullivan received an unexpected phone call from Katharine Hepburn. Decades earlier, she had wanted to play Anne herself. The character had never really left her. Now, she had a suggestion: fly to California, audition her niece, Skylar Grant. Sullivan did, and Grant impressed him. Natural red hair, freckles, emotional steadiness. For a moment, it felt like the answer had arrived early. Then reality stepped in. Anne of Green Gables was considered Canadian cultural property. The CBC and Telefilm Canada were firm. Anne had to be Canadian. No exceptions. Not even for a Hepburn. So, Sullivan went back to zero. The search stretched across the country, from Newfoundland to Vancouver. More than 3,000 girls were seen. What Sullivan learned quickly was that he wasn't looking for sweetness, or charm, or cuteness. He needed stamina, emotional range, a child who could carry an entire world without collapsing under it. Early in that process, Megan Follows auditioned, and she didn't shine. She felt slightly too old. Her first reading sounded too modern. A second screen test, even in costume, landed flat. Most productions would have moved on. Sullivan didn't. Something about her stayed with him. Not what she showed, but what seemed buried underneath. Then came the audition that changed everything. On the day of her callback, disaster hit at home. A toilet overflowed. Water flooded the house. Panic. Stress. Chaos. Follows arrived late. Flustered. Uncentered. No polish left to hide behind. And that's when Anne appeared. The strain stripped away performance and exposed something raw. Impulsive. Overloaded. Emotionally wired. Not an actress demonstrating a character. A girl living inside one. Sullivan recognized it instantly. That wasn't preparation paying off. That was truth breaking through. Follows wanted the role fiercely. She taped affirmations around her house. I am Anne of Green Gables. Not as hope, as conviction, and the final turn feels almost scripted. Skylar Grant didn't disappear. She became Diana Barry. The one place Anne's world feels safe. One phone call, 3,000 auditions, a flooded bathroom, and a late arrival that finally revealed the Anne everyone had been chasing. Number 4. Playing Anne Shirley wasn't just emotionally demanding, it was chronologically violent. Anne of Green Gables wasn't filmed in the gentle order the story suggests. It was shot the way productions usually are. Whatever location was ready, whatever weather cooperated, whatever schedule didn't collapse. That meant Megan Follows never lived Anne's growth in a straight line. One day she was 12, wide open, all nerves and imagination. Hours later, she was 14, sharper, more guarded. By the end of the week, she was 16 and a half. Still dreaming, but already learning how easily the world bruises people who dream too loudly. Those aren't cosmetic shifts, they're entire internal rewrites. And Follows didn't have the luxury of easing into them. She had to switch emotional weather on command. Sometimes within the same day, sometimes within the same scene. Her secret weapon wasn't technique, it was her body. Wardrobe and hair became her compass. When her hair was braided and she wore the orphan dress and worn shoes, her posture softened without thinking. Her movements became quicker, more impulsive, less protected. When the costumes changed, Anne aged instantly. Costuming wasn't just continuity, it was survival. And then there's the moment where performance and reality collapse into the same space. The White Sands Hotel recital scene. Anne performing The Highwayman. It doesn't work because it's polished. It works because it isn't. According to Kevin Sullivan, this was new territory for Megan Follows. Standing alone, exposed, delivering dramatic poetry in front of a room full of people. The tension you feel isn't crafted. It's real. Her hands tighten. Her focus locks in. The fear sits right under the surface. Anne isn't the only one on that stage. Megan is there too. Even the location carries its own quiet ghost story. The scene was filmed at the real Windermere House, a grand hotel that later burned down in 1996. The building vanished. The moment didn't. That's why Anne's growth feels honest. It wasn't shaped in comfort. It was lived in fragments. Childhood, adolescence, early adulthood. Swapped like costume changes. Not seamless. Not easy. Just real enough to hurt. Number 5. While Anne was finally taking shape, Gilbert Blythe was quietly becoming a problem. The production was moving forward. Locations were locking, schedules were tightening, but the one character who had to match Anne's fire without overpowering it still wasn't cast. Gilbert couldn't just be charming. He had to feel real, awkward, competitive, warm in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. Time was running out. Kevin Sullivan was already leaning toward another actor, not out of conviction, but out of necessity. That's what pressure does. You start choosing just to keep things moving. Then the answer arrived from the least impressive place imaginable. Casting director Diane Pauley went to a local high school production of The Wizard of Oz. Not a showcase, not a talent search, just a school play. And in the middle of all that amateur energy, one boy stood out. Not polished, not trained for television, just specific. Pauley didn't wait for a meeting. She didn't ask for consensus. She took a photo of him at Disneyland, rushed into Sullivan's office, dropped it on his desk, and made the call herself. This is Gilbert. The actor was Jonathan Crombie. He arrived without the kind of resume that makes executives comfortable. No screen experience. No camera confidence. Mostly school plays and amateur theater. When he auditioned, he didn't perform like someone chasing a lead role. He played like someone who didn't yet understand how much the role mattered. And when he got the call saying he was cast, he was shaking so badly he could barely speak. That innocence became the point. Crombie didn't build Gilbert as a romantic fantasy. He built him as a boy. Teasing because he's fascinated. Competing because he doesn't know how else to connect. Growing into respect instead of starting with it. For an entire generation, that version became definitive. The set energy around him mattered too. During the spelling bee scene, Crombie made a choice that wasn't in the script. Instead of playing Gilbert as effortlessly cool, he leaned into awkwardness. Let himself fail. Let himself look ridiculous. Megan Follows couldn't keep a straight face. Takes kept breaking. Laughter slipped through scenes that were supposed to feel tense. Even serious moments cracked open. Follows and Colleen Dewhurst would exchange glances when Sullivan delivered intensely earnest direction. Lines meant to tremble with importance suddenly felt lighter, human. That playfulness wasn't accidental. It created trust. And trust is what makes chemistry believable. What's easy to forget is how close this never came together. One school play, one photo, one last-second decision. Sometimes casting isn't about finding the most prepared actor. It's about recognizing the right spirit before the moment passes. Number 6. Colleen Dewhurst was told not to do Anne of Green Gables. Her agent saw the project as a detour, a television adaptation, a quiet, domestic story. Respectable, but small. The kind of role that didn't advance a serious stage career. Dewhurst heard something else. She didn't remember Anne as literature. She remembered it as a childhood ritual. One of the first books her mother ever read to her after bedtime stories gave way to real sentences. So when Marilla Cuthbert appeared, it didn't feel like a job to consider. It felt like something to guard. She said yes immediately. On set, Dewhurst carried that sense of ownership into everything, including the messy parts. She was a legendary stage actress, huge presence, impeccable instinct. But memorization wasn't her greatest strength. When lines slipped, she didn't stop. She filled the gaps with invention. Words like whatchamacallits, boofers, and half-formed phrases spilled out mid-sentence, as if Marilla's disciplined mind had hit a bump and refused to acknowledge it. Instead of weakening scenes, it gave them life. The cast cracked up. Retakes followed. But something important happened in those moments. Nothing felt stiff. Nothing felt museum perfect. During the dinner scene with Miss Stacy, Dewhurst struggled with a longer speech. She replaced "your feather-brained ways" with improvised phrasing that somehow landed sharper. Lines that sounded more like irritation than rehearsal. Sullivan kept the energy. Because it was true, her influence extended beyond her own performance. Jonathan Crombie arrived with no on-camera experience. This was his first real screen role. Dewhurst pulled him aside early and gave him advice that stayed with him for life. In period work, she said, "You don't just learn dialogue, you learn restraint, how people sit with emotion, what they're allowed to say out loud, what they swallow." Crombie later said that lesson shaped how he approached acting from that point forward. But Dewhurst's most important contribution wasn't a line or a gesture. It was a missing emotional truth. After filming Matthew's death, she went to Kevin Sullivan quietly. In the novel, Marilla finally says what she's buried the entire story. That Anne is her own flesh and blood. Without that moment, Dewhurst felt Marilla's arc stayed incomplete. The audience would sense the love, but never feel the release. Sullivan listened. That morning, he wrote a short scene. They filmed it quickly. 3 takes. No spectacle. Just grief pressing so hard that restraint finally broke. That scene exists because Dewhurst asked for it. She didn't just portray Marilla, she finished her. Number 7. Anne of Green Gables didn't just cast a community. It quietly became one. When Kevin Sullivan needed moments that felt real, especially from children, he didn't rely on performance alone. He relied on something you can't manufacture. Family. The clearest example is Minnie May Barry, Diana's little sister, a small character who becomes an emotional landmine. Her illness scene doesn't play like scripted drama. It plays like panic, a child struggling to breathe while adults scramble, terrified and helpless. That's because what you're watching isn't polished acting. Sullivan cast his own 4-year-old niece, Morgan Chapman. Even he admitted later he didn't know how she would handle a scene that intense. The set that day was hot, crowded, loud, overstimulating. Morgan grew tired, then confused, then she broke down. The cameras kept rolling. What landed on screen wasn't a performance pushed too far. It was a real emotional moment, caught carefully inside a controlled space. Sullivan was clear about the boundary. Her parents were right there. The distress was temporary. The environment was watched closely. The power of the scene comes from honesty, not pressure. Once you recognize that instinct, you see it everywhere. Relatives quietly appear in small roles. Megan Follow's own mother shows up on screen. Faces repeat. Connections form. None of it is presented as a gimmick. It's practical, intimate. It keeps the world of Avonlea from feeling like a temporary film set that rolled in and vanished. It feels rooted. That's why Anne of Green Gables doesn't feel like a production that ends when the cameras stop. It feels like a place that already existed before the crew arrived. And that sense of safety matters. Because when the story leans into pain, fear, or loss, the warmth around it feels earned, not artificial. The illusion works because the foundation is human. Number 8. Anne Shirley's puffed sleeves were never just a costume detail. They were a declaration. In Anne's world, puffed sleeves represent wanting something for yourself. A small, almost defiant dream in a life that has trained her not to ask. And those sleeves didn't exist by accident. They had to be engineered. The costume department physically stuffed them with extra fabric so they would stand tall and exaggerated, exactly the way Anne imagined them. It wasn't styling, it was structure. When the stuffing was forgotten in later scenes, the difference was immediate. The sleeves collapsed. So did the illusion. Kevin Sullivan noticed right away. From that point on, the cast began protecting the detail themselves. Megan Follows later said they started stuffing the sleeves by hand, determined to make them as puffed as possible, like they were defending Anne's dream, one scene at a time. But the sleeves were only the visible struggle. Underneath the dresses was the real endurance test. Corsets, layers, restriction. Authenticity demanded it. Bodies paid the price. Colleen Dewhurst refused early. After a few days, she was done. She flatly declined to keep wearing a corset. Megan Follows lasted longer. But by the time filming wrapped on the sequel, the release came quietly and privately. She burned her corset in a bonfire, not as a statement, as relief. Even Anne's red hair created problems. The green of her dress sometimes photographed wrong, flattening into gray on camera. So the color had to be enhanced later to preserve the contrast. Fiery red against hopeful green. When Anne spins, glowing, looking exactly the way she's supposed to, it's easy to forget what it took to get there. Stuffed fabric, refused corsets, a bonfire goodbye, color correction to keep the dream alive. Those puffed sleeves weren't just wardrobe, they were a victory. Number 9. One of the most dreamlike moments in Anne of Green Gables was also one of its most unpleasant to film. The Lady of Shalott scene looks effortless on screen. Anne drifting across the water, still, poetic, almost weightless. Behind the camera, it was an engineering problem wrapped in misery. The sequence was shot in pieces. Close-ups in a swamp outside Toronto. Wider shots in a pond somewhere else entirely. Neither location had a natural current. The boat wouldn't move. So the crew became the river. Members of the prop team stripped down and waded into thick, filthy water. Leech-infested, cold, unforgiving. They swam beneath the boat, physically towing it forward so it would glide on its own. What feels like natural drift is human muscle pulling from underneath the frame. The sinking beats were even more precise. The boat filling with water was filmed near shore, then repositioned farther out so Megan Follows could sit upright. A crew member hid beneath the boat and manually pulled it under at the exact moment Anne lunges for the pier. Timing had to be perfect. What plays as one seamless, lyrical moment is actually a puzzle assembled from uncomfortable, risky fragments. Swamp shots, pond shots, hands dragging wood through water no one wanted to stand in. That's the pattern again. Beauty on screen, endurance underneath. The illusion only works because someone was willing to disappear below the surface and suffer quietly so the dream could float. Number 10. Anne of Green Gables looks like the kind of production where everything was carefully placed before the cameras rolled. That isn't what happened. To keep the schedule alive, Kevin Sullivan began filming before the puzzle was fully solved. Not small inserts, not filler shots, real story texture. Sweeping exterior moments were captured early, with a body double standing in for Anne. Wide shots of a girl moving through autumn fields. Winter air cutting across open land. The face didn't matter yet. The feeling did. Sullivan was betting that the right Anne would arrive later and pour a soul into images that already existed. The gamble sharpened when Matthew Cuthbert wasn't fully locked. Richard Farnsworth was still in negotiations while the production moved forward. Key sequences were staged with a stand-in, moments tied to major story beats, including the panic surrounding Minnie May's illness. Sullivan later admitted how dangerous that was. If Farnsworth had walked away, those scenes would have become beautiful ghosts. Expensive footage with no real Matthew to anchor them. Even after casting settled, doubles remained part of the process. Scheduling conflicts meant stand-ins filled frames. Close-ups were captured later, the illusion stitched together in the edit. That's why the finished miniseries feels almost unreal, because the calm you see on screen was built on forward motion without guarantees. Anne of Green Gables didn't wait for certainty. It moved on instinct, on nerve, on momentum. And somehow, the right faces stepped into the frame as if they had always been there. Number 11. You can spot the lie before anyone says a word. Those famous red roads of Avonlea, they weren't real. They didn't exist where the cameras were rolling. Anne of Green Gables looks inseparable from Prince Edward Island. The soil, the curves of the land, that specific shade of red that feels burned into memory. But the production wasn't filmed there. Southern Ontario stood in. Not because Sullivan didn't want the real place, because the real place was impossible. Too expensive, too slow, too logistically fragile for a long television shoot. So the crew did something bolder. They rebuilt Avonlea somewhere else. Roads were literally dyed red to mimic PEI's famous soil. Historic villages were dressed, redressed, and reframed until they stopped reading as Ontario at all. Westfield Heritage Village became the heart of Avonlea. Doon Heritage Village doubled for Rachel Lynn's world. A turn-of-the-century schoolhouse at the Simcoe County Museum became Anne's classroom. The camera learned where not to look. Modern buildings stayed just outside the frame. Angles were chosen like secrets. Every shot designed to hide the present. By the time the illusion was complete, something strange had happened. Millions of viewers didn't just watch Prince Edward Island. They learned it. The geography rewired memory so completely that the stand-in replaced the original. For many people, Avonlea doesn't exist on a map. It exists in images filmed somewhere else entirely. And there's a quiet, poetic twist beneath it all. Avonlea was inspired by Cavendish, Lucy Maud Montgomery's hometown on PEI. Many of the Ontario locations used for filming sit not far from Leaskdale, where Montgomery later lived and wrote. The geography drifted. The spirit circled back. Anne of Green Gables didn't capture a place. It manufactured one so carefully that it became real in people's minds. Number 12. Green Gables wasn't found. It was assembled. There was no single cozy farmhouse waiting to be filmed. No perfect location hiding in the countryside, ready to become home. What audiences remember as one place was actually a construction. A careful illusion built from pieces that were never meant to belong together. The front of Green Gables came from one real farm. The back came from another, and every interior scene was filmed somewhere else entirely. The most recognizable exterior came from Butternut Farm, northeast of Toronto. The camera loved it. Reality didn't. The house sat close to a modern road. Traffic noise leaked into quiet moments. Go too wide, and the present crept into the frame. So the production worked around the truth. Angles were restricted, shots were controlled, modern farm equipment vanished between takes. The famous white picket fence didn't exist. It was built for the camera, painted, positioned, and framed to seal off the outside world. Then the illusion deepened. The back of Green Gables was filmed at a completely different location, chosen not for accuracy, but for clean sightlines, for control. The edit never lets you linger long enough to compare. Your brain fills in the gaps. Memory does the rest. And the heart of Green Gables, the place where the story truly lives, wasn't on any farm at all. Every interior was built on a soundstage. Walls could be moved, light could be softened, silence could be protected. Those close, sacred moments between Anne, Matthew, and Marilla would have been impossible inside a working farmhouse. Green Gables feels real because it was designed the way memories are designed, by selecting the right pieces and hiding the seams. A front borrowed from one place, a back borrowed from another, an interior built from nothing. Stitched together, it becomes a home, not because it existed, but because it felt like it always had. Number 13. Anne of Green Gables feels like a single, fixed memory. One version, one rhythm, one ending. That's an illusion too, because the miniseries didn't exist as just one cut. It was a Canada-Germany co-production. And for German television, Anne wasn't simply dubbed, she was rebuilt. Kevin Sullivan shot additional material specifically for the German release. Not trims, not alternate takes, new scenes, new beats. Roughly 9 extra minutes of story that many North American viewers never saw. 2 German actors were cast. New sequences were integrated. The structure shifted just enough to create a parallel version of Anne's world. So for years, 2 audiences grew up loving the same story while quietly carrying different memories of it. Different rhythms, different moments, different emotional weight. But the most important revision wasn't made for another country. It was made for the ending. Sullivan was unhappy with the original finale. The lighting felt flat. The pacing rushed. The tone, to him, betrayed what Anne had earned. In the first version, Gilbert's teasing carrot lands as a playful button, a light gag, a wink. Sullivan felt it shrank Anne at the very moment she should have been standing tall. So he did what most productions avoid. He went back. The ending was reshot. The joke was stripped away. The energy softened. No punchline, no armor, just recognition, growth, a moment that lingers instead of dissipating. That's why Anne of Green Gables feels so settled in memory. Not because it was perfect the first time, but because it was corrected until it felt true. Different cuts existed, different endings were tested. The one that survived didn't leave audiences with a laugh. It left them with a feeling. Number 14. When Anne of Green Gables aired in 1985, it didn't feel disposable. It didn't arrive like a piece of television meant to be watched once and replaced. It landed like an event. Viewers felt it immediately. This wasn't mocking the novel. It wasn't rushing through it. It wasn't sanding it down into something polite and forgettable. It was taking the story seriously, and the audience responded to that respect. The recognition followed quickly. Awards stacked up, an Emmy win, a flood of Gemini Awards, and a Peabody Award for Kevin Sullivan. That last one mattered most. A Peabody isn't about popularity. It's a signal that something mattered culturally, that this production didn't just entertain, it elevated what television could be. Sullivan didn't let that moment fade. He built outward. First came Anne of Green Gables, the sequel. Then, Road to Avonlea, which didn't just expand the world, it became a comfort ritual, a place viewers returned to again and again because the emotional temperature felt safe. Animated adaptations followed. Later continuations pushed Anne and Gilbert into adulthood. New versions reshuffled timelines, took bigger risks, chased different generations. For years, Sullivan's version didn't coexist with the novel. It replaced it. For millions of viewers, Anne Shirley wasn't a literary figure anymore. She was Megan Follows. Marilla was Colleen Dewhurst. Green Gables looked exactly one way, felt exactly one way. That kind of dominance always comes with a cost. Over time, control of Anne's screen future shifted. Rights changed hands. New stakeholders arrived. New directions pulled the story forward without the creative force that had defined it for decades. But here's the part that proves how deep the imprint really went. Even when Sullivan isn't involved, his version never leaves the room. Every new Anne is measured against a feeling, not a budget, not costumes, not production value. Spirit. Awards fade, franchises fracture, but Anne of Green Gables didn't just succeed, it embedded itself. And once you understand what it took to create that sense of gentleness, the risk, the endurance, the hidden struggle behind the calm, the magic doesn't disappear. It deepens, because Anne of Green Gables isn't just remembered for what it shows. It's remembered for how it makes the past feel reachable, like you could step through the screen, hear the wind in the trees, and believe just for a moment that kindness might still be enough. And now that you know what it took to build that illusion, the warmth doesn't fade. It stays. If Anne of Green Gables still pulls you back to Avonlea, if that quiet sense of wonder still lingers longer than it should, then maybe it's worth returning with new eyes. Not to relive the story, but to notice what was hidden inside it. The choices made under pressure. The risks buried beneath gentleness. The human effort that turned struggle into comfort. Sometimes knowing how something was built doesn't break the spell. It sharpens it. And if you'd like to revisit Anne of Green Gables again, you'll find links below to the DVD and multi-version releases, each one carrying a slightly different echo of the same memory. Thanks for spending this time inside the illusion. We'll meet again in the next story. Behind the Fact.